It was technically last week, but I want to thank you all for 1 year of Titanic Talkline, and I'm really excited to present this super, super, super special interview with Don Lynch. Enjoy! Ahoy, and welcome to Titanic Talkline. I am Alexia, and today I am joined by someone who doesn't need an introduction, so I'm not going to give too much of one. It is the one and only Don Lynch. How are you, Don? And I would like to let everyone know that I'm running super late, so I'm just really grateful that he still came.
Well, I'm doing okay. Thank you very much.
Awesome. I'm really lucky because I got to hear you do a talk a couple weeks ago where you talked in depth about your experience on the Cameron film and then on your experience with the was it a documentary or like would you call it?
It was
Yeah.
Goes to the Abyss, a 3D
Yes.
IMAX documentary. Yes. I say IMAX. IMAX is technically a company, but it's called large format, but we all know it as IMAX.
Gotcha. Sure. That makes sense. And that came out in 2003?
2000, probably 2000, 2003, sometime around there. Yes.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, I was just making sure I got the timeline right. That was really fascinating to look at the behind the scene because I think that for anyone who's a fan of the movie, you've gone and watched the behind the scenes documentaries and you've got the book and you have, all of those things. But hearing you talk about the revisit was really interesting because I think we don't really think too much about that, maybe.
Yeah. Maybe not. Yeah, I think about it. Yeah.
For sure. Well, I really liked hearing about it because you were also able to show a lot of things like how much it's changed really since, all that footage and the movies being filmed in 97 and how much forensically and to the wreck has just changed between then too.
Well, and a lot of the forensics are because Jim was able to go down there and dive more in 2001, and then he went back in 2005. And his studying of the wreck and the debris and everything has given us more insight into how the ship broke apart is when it went down.
Yeah, and I've talked to a couple of people on, excuse me, on the show before who have been in the Titanic community for, decades and decades and decades. And, they remember the discovery of, the wreck in 85 with Bob Ballard and how just fundamentally that sort of changed the Titanic historical I don't know what the word I'm looking for is.
The understanding, I guess you might say, because
exactly
we, in spite of the evidence and in spite of the testimony of the survivors, we just hung on to the fact that the ship went down in one piece. And yet any, person who ever built ships could tell you a ship that long could not have gone down by the bow and not split in half. And we just all sort of ignored them until they found it in two pieces, based upon the fact that the inquiries claimed it went down in one piece. Lightoller, the second officer, then of course Colonel Gracie, and then Lawrence Beasley, who wrote books immediately afterwards, both kind of followed that pattern. And the interesting thing with Beasley is that one lady I knew who was in his boat, and she always swore it broke in two, and she said that people around her talked about it. And yet Lawrence Beasley was in that boat, in his book, he said it went down in one piece. And so, it's embarrassing that we hung on to that the way we did.
I think it boils down to that whole who gets to tell the narrative thing, where if, like you were just saying, Lightoller being the highest ranking officer there, it's like, I said this happened, and then a bunch of other people who are reasonably high up go, yep, I sign off on that too, and I second and I third it. Then it's like, stamped it, it's fact. And, it took, I can't do math really quickly, but it took 70 odd years for them to then be like, actually, we went and we looked at it with our physical eyeballs and we see it's in two pieces.
And exactly. And yet all these witnesses at both inquiries kept saying that the ship broke in two, and they described it in detail. And somebody even, like one person said it was like cutting it with a knife. Somebody else said you could see things falling out of the aft part, all that sort of stuff. And yet, we just didn't believe them.
As silly as it sounds, there's a very visceral part of the movie, when the ship breaks in half.
Yes.
And I didn't see this until I saw it again, as an adult on the big screen. A porthole just kind of goes woo across the screen. And I had never noticed that before, but all of a sudden you're just watching this massive, and I had seen the big piece. So by now I saw how big and thick the metal of these portholes were, and it just went flying like a hair tie that you let loose.
Yeah. And it's great. It was a great visual because, of course, when they went back and reissued the movie in 3D, they had this porthole which, here's something for 3D. That'll really jump out at the audience.
It does.
Yeah.
I noticed it because it was in 3D. It was just like, oh my gosh.
Yeah.
What was that? And it's such a small little detail, but it demonstrates the incredible force. Like, and again, I think that's, the reason I go back to the breakup and people denying it is because I'm like, that must have just been such a
Yeah.
monstrous moment to witness. This
Hmm.
massive behemoth with
Yes.
people still on it,
Yeah. Yeah.
just breaking in half. And Stephen Beale talks about it a bit in his book, where how kind of then as in now, it was sort of quote unquote easy to ignore the people who were saying that because a lot of them were women. Now, I don't know how true necessarily, like how, I don't know the exact breakdown of who was at the time saying things, but
Yeah, but it was the men at the inquiries who were saying it broke in two. So, and yet we ignored them too.
that's fair. All right. Well, I guess it just goes to show you how much a narrative you need to be preserved shall be preserved. But
Yes. Yes.
I also forgot to ask you, which I normally ask everybody to tell me a little bit and everyone about your individual Titanic story, because especially your story has brought you to so many incredible places. Just, how did this all? Where did we start?
Yeah. Well, I like to say you're born with it. It's like people who collect stamps, they can't explain why they like it.
Fair.
And I think there is, but it's easy to be born with this because it's such a phenomenal story. The biggest ship in the world, its maiden voyage, it's unsinkable. And so I remember seeing, the 1953 Titanic as a child and thinking that was a really cool movie. But when I went to school on Monday, everybody was talking about it. It was a Saturday afternoon feature on TV, and on Monday morning, all the kids were saying, "Did you see Titanic on Saturday?" And then in 1973, when I was in high school, the Poseidon Adventure came out, and I went and saw it, and that movie holds up really well on the big screen. And so I wanted to know what was going on, what were real shipwrecks about. I was more into nonfiction, and so I went to the library, checked out some books, and one of them was A Night to Remember. And so, of course, I read it and then read it again. I just went over and started it all over again. And then started just doing some research on my own. And I wrote to Harland and Wolff, and they recommended the Titanic Historical Society. And I joined them. And then I bought every back issue of their magazine ever. And they had always made survivors honorary members. And yet, a lot of many of the survivors were immigrants, meaning they were like, teenagers, maybe 20. And the society was formed after 50 years. And yet, where were these people when they should have only been in their early 70s? And of course, the children, who would, it should have all still been alive, most of them when I was first got interested in it. And so I started tracking them down. And in doing that, then you end up getting their story. I'd write to libraries and they'd say, well, we don't know where they are now, but here's a newspaper interview with them from the time and things like that. And it kind of became sort of an expert on the people, I guess you'd say. But that's where the story lies. If there hadn't been any survivors, we wouldn't know what happened to the Titanic. We could only study the wreck and we wouldn't even know where to have looked for it. And so, it just kind of became that. Then I was asked to become the historian for the Titanic Historical Society, which I've been since. And then eventually, when Madison Press wanted to do this coffee table book, I was asked them. I can't remember how it got started, but somehow
Sure.
I was chosen to write the text for it. And then, of course, Jim used that book to pitch the movie to Fox. And then and then became the historian for the movie. And then Jim, used me again to go back for Ghosts of the Abyss. And so it's just, one of those things that just keeps going, going, going. You kind of dig a hole you can't climb out of. But I've certainly, made wonderful friends over the years. Gotten to know, a bunch of the survivors who obviously now are gone, but just, many of my friends are people who also are Titanic people, Titanic enthusiasts, Titanic historians, you name it. And, it's really benefited me in a lot of ways personally and been wonderful for me.
Out of all the experiences, I'm sure that this is, a question you might get a lot, but like, out of all the amazing experiences you've had to have from, working on the film and being invited to talk and writing this book, what has been maybe not the most like prestigious or what is in your mind when you think about all the stuff you've gotten to do? What's like your favorite little memory? You're like, oh, I'm just so glad that I got to do that, even if it's a big opportunity, but just for you, what is the thing that just kind of makes you happy when you think about it every time?
Well, what's make me happy, I guess, is, having worked on the movie and having been in the movie, that I have the one scene. And
Hmm.
when I was young, long ago, I always remember when I was little, or not little, but just say young, I used to think I never wanted to be an actor, but I always thought, wouldn't it be great to just be in one really good movie, just to have
Sure.
that one, that you could always point to a really great movie and say, yeah, I was in there.
Yeah, like,
And I
hey,
got
I was in
that.
Casablanca.
Yeah,
Whatever.
exactly. Something like that. I remember thinking at the time how cool it would have been to have been in 1941, the Steven Spielberg movie about World War II.
Ah, yes,
It
yes.
just looked like such a fun movie to have made. And I thought, boy, wouldn't it have been fun to have been in that? Wouldn't it be great to just be in one movie? So
Hmm.
I'd have to say if I have sort of a favorite, I mean, obviously there have been, emotional moments, diving to the wreck,
Oh,
being on the wreck on 9/11, was a big, big deal for
I
me.
want to talk about that later.
9/11 is a big deal for everybody, obviously, but
Yeah.
so but having been able to walk the decks of the Titanic and walk the rooms as they looked back then and experience them the way the people I had talked to had experienced them, so to speak, that was really special. That was incredible for me.
I imagine so. I'm sure that you've probably been to the at least one of the museums
Oh
before.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah, yeah, I was gonna say there's no way you haven't.
yeah.
But they have the recreation of the grand staircase with the
Hmm.
dome. And that's the closest a lot of people are going to get to, and it's beautifully done. It looks
Yes.
wonderful, and I do say you get a little moment. You turn the corner, come into that structure, and just see the beautiful staircase and the clock and the dome. Even it's a replica, but even for a moment, you just kind of go,
Yeah. Well, and on the movie set, on because the interior sets were on sound stages, but they were
right.
multi-story high, and you could literally walk out of Rose's suite, down the hall, down the grand staircase, several flights of stairs, through the reception room and into the dining room, and never know you weren't on a ship because all four walls were there, the ceiling was there, everything was there, and later they would determine if they needed to cut into it to maybe get
Hmm.
some more ventilation, maybe bring in some bigger lights, things like that. But when built it they built it intact so that it could be filmed from any angle if you were in any of those rooms, corridors, whatever. And so yeah, just like you said, with when you go to these exhibits, rounding the corner and seeing the staircase is pretty great, but to actually come out of a room, walk down a hallway, walk down the staircase several flights, and all the way into the dining room, that was over the top. That was phenomenal.
I'm trying to picture just what that must have been like. I don't know much about the actual how to make a movie. I assume that there's a lot of movie magic involved with
Yeah.
with certain things. But the more I hear about the making of Titanic, I'm kind of just like, they didn't rely a whole lot on movie magic for many of these moments. It was just real in-person practical effects.
Well, and it wouldn't be today. Today, it would be movie magic.
True.
Today, it would be like Avatar. It would all be green screen and everything would be filled in the background.
Yeah.
And you wouldn't have nearly so many sets. But that level of technology didn't exist 25 years ago.
Right.
And so, it was probably the last, say, era, period of time when a movie could be made, which would involve such elaborate sets. I
Hmm.
just don't think, and even then, not all of them. Like you see scenes in the lounge, they never made a lounge set. They made a miniature. And so some of that is movie magic.
Right.
But in other rooms, like the dining room, it's the real dining room. The staircase is the staircase. The suite is the suite. That sort of thing. The gymnasium, is
Mhm.
they made a whole gymnasium. And today, I don't think that would happen to that extent at all. So it was something that just won't ever be repeated, at least not for a movie. Somebody
Sure.
may duplicate something someday that tourists can go see. But, as far as what we were doing, that was pretty much it.
I was thinking back to Gone with the Wind, for example, and you have some of these beautiful sweeping shots of these manors and villas, and I'm trying to remember the specific scene. I think it's a hospital, and they pan over the town, and you can just tell that this is a soundstage, and it has to be because, as you were just discussing, the technology simply did not exist to CG construct the manor of Tara on the
Yeah.
grounds at the time that Vivian Lee was running around. You had to make the movie that way because it was out of necessity. But I personally feel that for some things, it gives it, this sounds almost like fake credit, but it gives it that timelessness because, you made do with what you had, and, you
Yeah.
didn't, you couldn't render, you couldn't go into Unreal Engines and say, make me a virtual Titanic. If, Jim, as you said, had to go and build me a Titanic.
Yeah. Well, they had matte paintings, where you could paint up part of the backdrop, and they'd had those in
Sure.
silent films, but you couldn't get a lot of motion on those. You
Yeah.
couldn't get, unless you had miniatures or something like that. And so, the special effects, every so often you'll see a movie that surprises you from that long ago that the special effects were as good as they were.
Hmm.
But today's audience looks at it and says special effects. Now, maybe in that time they did as well, but they took it for granted, that you
Right.
were going to see special effects. Today we want to see something that passes for the real thing. I think nobody had that expectation 100 years ago.
That's a fair point. I mean, a movie was just a completely different thing. And I've talked about it a little bit when we compare the sinking sequences from A Night to Remember to the Cameron film. And not in a negative way, but just in sort of what technology was available at the time and how movies were made and how audiences wanted their movies to be made.
Yeah.
Um, and one of the things that we were discussing is that, like, in reality, the sinking may not have been as dramatic as the Cameron film, or the initial iceberg striking sequence, I think is what I'm specifically referring to. It may not have been as, that 30 seconds of iceberg right at running up and down the stairs and screaming orders and the yelling, but it makes for great cinema, and I think it's an
Yeah.
iconic sequence. It gets my heart racing every time, and every time I watch, I'm like, but what if they miss the iceberg? And they never do. But watching the 50s movie, it was more subdued, and it was very much a product of its time. And now I'm learning a little bit more realistic, but in the way we make movies in 2023, I don't think people would quite want their film structured that way, which is
No, no, and I actually saw a lecture once, and it was by a gentleman who was the grandson of one of the bandsmen from the Titanic, and
ooh.
he put together clips from Titanic 19 or the 97 and A Night to Remember from 1958 where the scenes matched. For
Mhm.
example, what's going on the bridge, when they strike the iceberg, and then even when Andrews explains to Smith what's happening, and
Right.
he said, A Night to Remember is like watching a British naval training film because it's so slow, so subdued, and it couldn't possibly have been so subdued. In the 1958 film, they're sitting in Andrews' cabin, and Andrews is calmly explaining to Smith that they only have so much time, and he might as well have served him tea because you don't see him jumping up and saying, well, we've got to get the people in the boats. It's just like, well, really? Well, how long do we have? This sort of thing. And it's too calm. It is unbelievably calm. It's unrealistically calm. It just there is no way they just sort of stood around
Right.
and sort of talked about what was happening and that they would only have an hour to live. It's unbelievable. And I know people love A Night to Remember as their favorite, and everybody has their favorite, and that's fine. But you have to acknowledge that there is no perfect movie. You
No.
can't say 1958's A Night to Remember is perfect. And it's like, no, oh no, no. And they say, well, and they don't have those fictional characters. And it's like, oh, there are so many fictional characters in A Night to Remember. They just don't have them as the main characters.
Right.
But anyway, but they're both great movies. And
They are.
Jim actually, tips his hat to A Night to Remember. There are a few scenes that are very, very, like when Collapsible B drops down onto the deck and then a man lands down on top of it.
Hmm.
That's taken directly from A Night to Remember. And basically what Jim is doing is he's acknowledging, this
Hmm.
earlier movie and some great scenes in it.
There's a lot of direct homage, like that specific scene you're referring to the film. Obviously, he has great respect for it. That was not meant to
Oh,
say
yes.
it's a really good movie. It's
Yes.
just interesting to see how, a movie made in 1997 versus a movie made in 1958, which conceptually is not that far apart, but socially and sort of in the way of human development, they may as well have been made for completely different groups of human beings.
Yeah. Yeah. In a way, I guess you might even say they were, that both each of them was.
The times are just so different. I mean, even we look at how the media post sinking was handled and the way that we make media about the Titanic now versus how media was made about Titanic in 1912 versus how it was made in the 50s or 70s. It's also profoundly different. I remember I did not make it all the way through SOS Titanic. I am sorry, everyone. I simply did not. But that movie was once again made for a completely different demographic of people.
Yeah.
And it's so interesting to watch all three approaches. I'm not going to argue that, oh, this movie sucks and this one is great. All three of them have very different audiences, but it's just so interesting to see three profoundly different takes on the exact same thing.
It is. And it's interesting because when you think of the 1950s audience was even by 1958, when more and more people had their own televisions, your audience was still everyone.
Right.
Families went to the movies. By 1997, your demographic is 18 to 25. And realistically, it was like 12 to 25. And, and so it really was for a different audience. You had to have these young characters to make the love story, to draw people in, that sort of thing. And it's a very, very different demographic. And in fact, people forget about the 1953 movie, and it was on TV recently, and I watched it. And the one thing, one thing about Jim's movie is that, his takes place during the sinking on the ship versus
Yes.
in the lifeboats. You see the ship go down from the perspective of the people on board versus earlier movies where it's from the perspective of those in the lifeboats. But Titanic of 1953, you actually get to know real people who have to separate. And they aren't like Jack and Rose where they just met. I mean, Richard and Julia have been married for 25 years. And even though they're having marital problems, now they're suddenly realizing they have to resolve those problems in about 10 seconds because they're going to part forever. And the 1953 movie really captures the separation of couples, of families, more because you're more invested in that family and that couple than you are in any couple or family in any of the other movies.
I wanted because I knew I was going to get sucked into a wormhole if I started talking about families and people and emotion.
Yes.
But we're just going to do it for the rest of the episode probably, because you said that you like to talk about people and their stories as well. And
Sure.
yeah, and that's the part of Titanic that initially got me interested. Was I began to learn about, it's like, oh, it's not, Titanic is not one person's story. Full disclosure for everyone who's heard this before, I was 8 when the movie came out, when Cameron's movie came out, so I was quite young. So Titanic was sort of, the film was my introduction to the event. So my first comprehensive understanding of it was this one person's perspective, which is not bad, but it means that that's my baseline where it started. And then, so Jack and Rose were kind of like at the forefront of my brain, and it took me a while to figure out they weren't real and all of that. I was a kid.
Sure.
But, as I got older and started learning about more people's stories, that's what became more fascinating to me, was because you suddenly see the perspective from the second officer and the baker and this one woman that I didn't know existed who survived in second class that has a story to tell. You're like, oh my gosh, you find all these interesting perspectives. And the thing that started hitting home to me was reading all the testimonies from the left behind women and children, their accounts. I mean, there was a book published, I think, that was called like The City of Widows, that I might be mistaking, but it was just,
I think that's the title, about like all the ladies in Southampton who were widowed by the sinking. Yes,
exactly. And it was interesting to start learning about how this loss ripples outwards at the time, because it's not to say that losing a member of your family now isn't a big deal, but I'm legally allowed to work. I can go get a job and help my family. In, being a 35-year-old, maybe having children at the time, if I've just lost my husband, who had been the sole breadwinner for our family for our whole lives, and I have no work experience and never have, what am I supposed to do? Yeah. It's a profound, so not only I have to mourn my husband, I have to put on his boots and his coat basically and run the family in a way that you're neither allowed nor prepared for at that time. And it was very interesting learning about that sort of how tragedy compounds.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Well, and one lady I knew, she didn't want to get into a lifeboat because she said it was, quote unquote, wicked that a single girl like her could get into a lifeboat, but a married man with a wife and children to support could not. And she just thought that was terrible. And she only got into a boat because someone came up with a baby and they couldn't get into the boat, and someone had to take the baby. And she figured, well, it's the only hope the baby has of surviving, because, she also, and she, I learned a lot from her, because we know in 2020 hindsight, if you got into a lifeboat, you survived. Yeah. She didn't know that. So in her mind, the ship's going down, I'm probably going to die. And then, but then this baby came into her life, and suddenly I have to rescue a baby, or the baby will die too, for sure. And then
Hmm.
that saved her life.
Wow. I think I'm sure there's so many little stories like that that we either don't know about or are never going to know about, or people who tried to do little acts who maybe didn't make it,
Yes.
and
Yeah.
we'll just never hear about, because we hear about the heroics of like Charles Jachin, who was like, oh, you don't want to get in a lifeboat, I'll just throw you in then, how
Yeah.
about that?
Yeah.
And I'm sure there may have been other men doing same things who maybe didn't make it, and we'll just
Yeah.
never get to hear about there's the little things they tried to do or people
Hmm.
tried to do to help
Oh,
or
I
didn't
think
do.
so. Two of the very last bodies found was, I think, a Middle Eastern girl, maybe about 14 or something, and a crew member, and they were both clinging to the same life ring. And now, did he help her, with the life ring, or did she have the life ring and she was willing to share it with him? And yet they both died. So you're right, we'll never know. But it seems to me that somehow the fact that two completely disparate people were clinging to this one life ring, there had to have been a story there, but it died with them.
Yeah, and it the, finding out little things like that make me appreciative of the tiny stories that you do get to learn, because they're just little insights into each individual person's life.
Yeah.
and
Yes.
and I imagine that also, because I've spoken to a couple of people who have dove down to the wreck before, and I also imagine that when all these stories, going down there and looking at the thing, the object itself, almost the elephant in the room,
Yeah.
and you get to see it. What is that like?
Well, I knowing all these stories, I dove to the wreck twice. And
Right.
on one of the dives, and I don't remember which one, um, I kept thinking about the survivors.
Mm-hmm.
You look and think, okay, here's where this lifeboat was launched, and these people were in it, and here's the door that, Mrs. Snyder came out of when she and her husband came up on deck, and here's where the band played or whatever. And then, the next time or the other time, I kept thinking about the victims. And well, I'm sorry, yeah, because here, the victims here is where the band played. Obviously, there's a group of
Yeah,
victims.
right.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to lump them in with the survivors. And like, here is where boat 8 left, and this is where Mr. and Mrs. Strauss stood, and where she wouldn't get in, and things like that. And so, I kind of, I had two opportunities, and one of which I focused on the victims, the other one I focused on the survivors and their stories as they related to the bow section, which is the only part I got to see.
Right. That was it just a lot? Like I feel as though if I saw the ship, I would either be in that sort of wonderstruck awe, or I would immediately have a panic attack. And that's not meant to be a joke. It's just sort of like,
Yeah,
whoa, oh, it's huge, and it's there, and it's in this state.
yeah, it's incredible. Part of it, well, part of the dives, there were working dives, and so you are kind of preoccupied with that. We weren't
Sure.
just sightseeing, but you get a very small porthole to look out of, and the
Fair.
side of the submersible is very thick, and so you can't look off to the side the way you could through an airplane or a car window or something. You can only look straight up, so you are limited there. And
Okay.
if you were in this perfect, glass bubble where you could look all the way around at everything around you, I think you'd be overwhelmed. But you see what you can see, and you
That's
just
fair.
take that in. And of course, we had cameras outside, and we had monitors. Their cameras were, the 3D IMAX cameras. They were tilting, they were panning, they were zooming, and I kept wanting to look at the monitors because the cameras were seeing more than I could. And I had to remind myself, Don, you can see all of that footage later. You need to look at the real thing. And I would stare out the porthole at whatever I could see out there. But the things that kind of impressed me that I did see, it's more colorful than it seems on film. For some reason, in real life, like the greens are more green, and the corrosion is more corroded looking, and just to me the colors are a little more brilliant. And I don't know why that would be, because we were using high def film. Um, but the other thing that impressed me was that I knew where I was, and that really surprised me. I think I talked about that at the when you saw me speak.
You did, but I would
Because,
love to hear about it again because it would well, it helped visualize for me too exactly
yeah.
also how big this wreck is.
Well, and in the movies they always come up to the bow, and then there it is towering over them with light from behind, whatever. But
The
we came,
scene.
yeah, exactly. And whereas we came up to the side, and my first dive, I was diving with Jim, and he
Mhm.
just basically said, "Don, there's your Titanic." And I had studied the story. Ken Marshall, who did the illustrations for the book and
Mhm.
everything, the paintings, and he studies the ship. I mean, he knows every wire stay, he knows the perimeter of every porthole, this sort of thing. And so we're rising up, and I recognized where I was, that I could just see a little portion of the hull, and I knew where I was. And that impressed me that I knew the Titanic, the ship itself, better than I thought I did. So that was really exciting for me, and that's something I probably could never, will never repeat. But it was something completely unexpected and very exciting.
Uh, I can see that being a really, really profound moment because, like you said, you've studied the things and you've read all the books and you have this sort of conceptual knowledge of this thing. I keep saying thing, but it's
Yeah,
almost like Titanic's not, it's almost not real. You've just, you spend all your time in the mythos for so long that when you finally get to see the real thing, I'm sure it's exciting to be able to put those pieces together like, oh, that's the entrance to the first class dining room and that's the davit that
yeah,
everyone sees a picture of. It's
yeah. Uh-huh.
able to be like, those are the things.
Yes. Well, it's like one of the survivors, a lady in Sweden. I want to say, no, I believe she was still alive when they found the wreck, but she, in her old age, couldn't reconcile the Titanic you hear about all the time. This great, cultural icon versus the shipwreck she was in, because she'd hear all these, stories and think she'd have to remind herself, I was there. It's like you go see the movie Titanic and think, wow, I was there. And so, that was for her, it was sort of that thing because it had become such a cultural phenomenon that she had a hard time reconciling that was this horrible shipwreck she had been through, this one that was always in the papers, so to speak.
That's really, I'd never considered the that sort of impact on
Yeah,
survivors and that
yeah,
this experience you've had becomes part of the like the cult the the mythology of the world
yeah.
in a
The
strange way.
folklore, everything. It's just,
Yeah,
yeah. It's like you got to stop and think about it. Is that really? I mean, I'm putting words in their mouth, obviously,
sure,
but was that really where I was? That sort of thing. Because for some people, it was traumatic for everybody, if you're old enough to recognize what was happening. But, some
sure.
people did have an easier time. And yet they still emotionally suffered. And of course, everybody had to listen to all those screams, of all the people dying. But, for some people, you went up on deck and they said, would you please get in this lifeboat? And you did, and you got away and you had plenty of room and, you were warm enough. And, then the ship goes down and suddenly you're hearing all these screams, and so it turns into something horrible, whereas other people had obviously separated from family members, and like maybe their lifeboat was too crowded and they thought it was going to overturn, and there was something, things like that was more chaotic towards the end,
Right.
and everybody had a different experience. And so for some people they probably look back, and I think it was even one of the Irish girls said to her when she wrote in a letter and said, you'll think I'm horrible to say this, but I'm kind of glad I went through it, because I'll never experience anything like that again.
It's not, it's funny.
It is, but it's everybody's in a way thinking that way is almost a form of hysteria.
I agree.
That it's like, wow, I was there, kind of thing, and it's emotionally how you're dealing with it versus I've lost so many of my friends, they're dead now, this kind of thing, and everybody has, you have to look at it with your own perspective to help you get through it. And some people do focus too I say too much for them, will say, on the trauma to where they really suffered emotionally just horribly for it.
Yeah, that's the danger too. And I brought this up several times on my show where, you didn't get you didn't get off the Carpathia and go talk to someone who's like, we're so sorry this happened to you. Here is a blanket. Here is some snacks. And we're going to get you to our mental health counselor right away. Don't worry about your daughter. She's going to go to our daycare center. It's all going to be fine. Like they didn't, that wasn't how it happened.
Not at all. No.
The resources just weren't there to handle
Yeah.
the, not just the immediate needs of, oh, you need a blanket, but they weren't there to handle, you're clearly traumatized. We need to take care of that as well.
Hmm. Yeah, it was funny. There was one lady and her daughter who survived it, and the daughter later said, "We just went on, because they didn't lose anybody. I mean, some people they knew on the ship or whatever, but no family members. It was just the two of them together, and they were coming over for the younger lady, the brother's, graduation from college." And she said, we had these family gatherings we still had to go to. We had to go to the graduation, and we just, kind of replaced our wardrobes and went on. But apparently, then several years later, she was 16 at the time, but several years later, she did finally have a nervous breakdown. And so I think there was some delayed trauma there, that always was kind of in the back of her mind that she didn't deal with, and then finally, maybe because of the trauma of World War One, caught up with her, that sort of thing. It just finally kind of hit her.
I just keep forgetting that the world exploded a few years later and
Well,
sort
yeah,
of.
yeah. In fact, I think this woman, I think the brother who I'm going to swear to it, but they went to his college graduation, and I think he died in the flu epidemic.
Oh my gosh.
And so, he wasn't on the Titanic with them, but they lost him anyway, kind of thing. And so, things like that maybe were what contributed her to this breakdown later. But I knew another lady whose mother and grandparents were on the ship, and her grandfather was lost. And she said her grandmother just put it behind her and wouldn't talk about it. Whereas her mother had to talk about it, was pretty much an emotional mess. The doctor had to come to the house every day. And I said to her, so really, your mother had a nervous breakdown? Well, I mean, this woman was still of that era where you didn't admit to emotional. She said, oh, no, no, not a nervous breakdown. But I want to say, well, it sure sounds like it. But I wasn't going to argue with her because there was that stigma of a nervous
Yeah.
breakdown implies a mental health, issue. But, you weren't allowed to have those, but you could still be upset about the Titanic.
Well, that was an understandable thing to be upset about, I think.
Yeah.
It makes a lot of sense. But it's just so interesting to think about how you handle that. I mean, to be perfectly fair, it's not like we handle grief perfectly now or trauma
No.
perfectly now.
Well, everybody's different. And then see, back in the 60s, they thought everybody had to talk about it. And people still think so today, or 60 years later, people still think that. And by the 1970s, they knew everybody's different. And again, this mother and daughter situation, the lady who couldn't stop talking about it, and the doctor had to come, and yet her mother wouldn't talk about it. So they each dealt with it differently. The one had to verbalize it to get over it. Her mother couldn't, because verbalizing it refreshed it for her. And they each, even though they were mother and daughter, they each had a separate direction they took with it, and that's how they dealt with it. And they know today everybody grieves, everybody suffers, everybody recovers in their own way. It's just you've got to figure out what that is. So telling somebody that they have to talk about it and get it out, you could be doing more harm than good. If it's better for them to just put it behind them and not even think about it, that's what they should do.
And I think I've heard a couple stories, and I can't attribute them to anyone's name, of people later in life finding out my insert relative here was on the Titanic and just never spoke about it until later in life because they couldn't.
Yes, and that was common. Yeah, I knew a lady in Santa Barbara who was on the Titanic. She was 12, and her daughter told me when I was young, she said, I knew my mother had grown up in India, and I thought that was so cool. And she said, but I knew she was in some shipwreck. It never occurred to me it was the Titanic. And so she was a child before she found out that her mother was on the Titanic. And it upset her mother to know that the neighbors knew, some of them did. Like this woman's brother came home one day and asked his mother, he said, my teacher wants you to come and talk to our class about the Titanic. And she just blew up. It's like, well, how does your teacher know? How did she find out? Because she didn't want to talk about it. It took her about 70 years to get to where she could really talk about it.
I don't blame people for that. I mean, people go through tragedies now that they can't talk about, even, having these understandings of different forms of behavioral therapy, different forms of grief therapy, different forms, and understanding that grief isn't linear, that recovery is non-linear.
Yes.
Even with all of those things, we just don't have a perfect way of handling trauma, because I think there is no perfect way to handle trauma, but we've definitely learned a lot in the past decades or so. My dog has something to say about that, I guess.
Well, I have a neighbor, or had a neighbor, friend of mine, and her father, and he only just died a few years ago in his 90s, and he never talked about World War II. He served overseas. and he just wouldn't talk about it. And yet others thought, I mean, there obviously aren't very many left, but they'll
Right.
talk about it to this day, and they got through it, and good or bad, they'll discuss it. But whatever he went through, he would not talk about it.
And again, it's understandable, and it's also kind of a pity in a way. We talk about learning the stories of people, and you only learn people's stories if they're willing to open up. But
Yeah.
you can't, as much as it might be quote unquote cool to force people to be like, tell me your story, it's important. But we can't demand that people
No, no, you
share
really
anything
can't.
about that with the world. And we're privileged and honored, especially I imagine, like, I've by the time I got around to Titanic, all the survivors have passed. So I've never met any of them, and unless things go really really wrong, I never will. But I imagine that it is a privilege to gather little stories, to weave them together into your understanding
Mhm.
of an event, because they're the ones who have that knowledge, and they can shed the tiny little details on things. I'm
Yeah,
like making a detail up, like that it always smelled like lilies in this one hallway because it had a lot of lilies in it. I mean, that's not a real thing, but just little
yeah.
details from people.
Hmm. Well, I knew one lady, and thank heaven she lived as long as she did, that we got her story because in the movie, of course, the boat that goes back and rescues Rose and a few other people out of the water,
Mm-hmm.
all the crewmen in that boat said we took all the women and put them in other boats. This lady and her mother were in that lifeboat when it went back. They did not get out. She was, I just said, so, I asked her when I first met her, what boat were you transferred to? And if you were in that boat, she said, I wasn't transferred. And I said, so you went back among the bodies? And she said, yes. And I let it drop because I felt that might be, a really horrible thing to ask her about because it was so, hard to just row through all those bodies. But her children have confirmed, they said when they were little, their mother would talk about it and they'd pick out a cry in the night and row towards it and it would die before they get there. And there is no reason to believe that this woman made that up. She was a perfectly honest woman. She obviously told her children this before the Titanic was a big deal.
Mm-hmm.
And everything I ever knew her to say about the Titanic was very honest. And now that she's gone, of course, I regret that maybe I should have pushed a little bit more for a few more details. But also, I wish I had asked her, do you think you have a reason why the crew members all said all the women were transferred out, or did they ask you not to say anything at the time? Because even she and her mother both gave interviews in 1912, and they didn't
Mm-hmm.
mention it. They never said they were transferred to another boat, but they never said we went back among the bodies. And
Mm-hmm.
I wish I pressed a little bit more about that. But she lived over in England, and I didn't get to visit her as often as I would have liked.
Right.
And so, but I'm so glad that she did share that because it does add that one little aspect to the sinking that they didn't get all of the women out of that boat when they went back. And there was actually another survivor who wrote in the letter how they transferred all the women out. And then she wrote, well, as many as they could. And so she implied that not all the women were transferred out. And here was a woman who was one who wasn't and went back. And I wish I'd asked her a bit more. But if she hadn't spoken up, probably nobody would have really taken that seriously. And they would have thought only men were in that boat when it went back and rescued those people.
I can see how that happened too. You're trying to move people around. You have a limited window of time. It's taking everyone too long to get from boat to boat. It's like we already waited 5 minutes. If you're still in this boat, you're coming with us.
Yeah, exactly. Or we don't have time to wait. And they probably
Mm-hmm.
didn't realize how traumatic it was going to be. And he probably was very sorry that he exposed women to this. And so, they went back and of course, this woman's father and her mother's husband, was there somewhere and they didn't see him or anything, but they ran that risk that what if they encounter his body? And stranger coincidences have happened, but at least it didn't to them, which is good.
I didn't think about that until just now. And crewmen in the boat must have seen some of their fellows as they rode through.
Maybe, yeah.
I mean, you almost hope they didn't, and in a
Yeah,
weird,
I agree. Yeah, that they didn't recognize anybody that, yeah.
you almost hope that isn't a cosmic way. You're not like, oh, there's Murdoch. I wondered where he went. It's like
Yeah.
I just pulled his name out of nowhere, but it's sort of just, you almost really hope that it was a bunch of strangers, and not that that's easy or
Yeah.
anything, but I can
Mhm.
only imagine how haunting that must be to have to, you wake up from a cold sweat in the middle of the night with your bunkmate's face in your mind. Just,
Yeah.
oh gosh, there's so many things that you don't consider about the impact of the Titanic, and I think it's just so interesting to me. Like, no matter how old I get, and I'm not even that old, there's always a new wave of people who are interested. I'm always meeting someone who's like, my son is interested, my daughter is writing a book, not a
Ah,
book, I'm sorry, like a paper,
yeah.
well, my
Okay.
kids are starting it in school and they're really interested. And my friend had me over about a year ago to show the Cameron film to her daughter for the first time because she was studying it in school and liked it. It's so interesting to see new interests continually pop up in this really heavy and impactful story.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely.
It's not to say that I don't encourage people to get interested. I think it's very interesting, but it's also surprising when I hear 8-year-olds. I'm like, you're not Paw Patrol?
Yeah.
Titanic? Okay. Okay, cool. Something we can
Yeah.
talk about.
It's funny. I remember years ago, somebody saying to me, "Well, will the interest go away when the last survivor dies?" And I said, "Well, every year the Titanic Historical Society has more members than ever before, and every year there are fewer survivors. I don't think that's going to happen." And sure
Benny,
enough, it didn't. It's bigger now than ever before, it seems.
that's amazing.
Yeah.
I'm running low on my time with you. So before I let you go, I it's a kind of a weird abstract question, but I guess, because you're one of the big names in the Titanic community and as more people are coming in, what do you think that people should who are new or even old fans, like what is something that we should just like always remember to keep in our brains? Like always it's important to always remember.
Um, Boy, I guess I guess it's important to remember that it was a human event, that there were people involved there because it is a fascinating subject. And I think that people need to remember that there were people involved and who they suffered and, the effects for years and years, financially, personally, whatever. And, I think that's important to just remember that, as cool it as it is,
Right.
that it's about a lot about people as well as not just the shipwreck itself, but what people went through.
Yeah. And last question. Obviously, I know your book, Titanic and Illustrated History. You also have several other books, but are you working on anything now, or mostly just helping out the historical society, touring
Uh,
around,
Yeah, just
appearing
mostly
on
helping out
podcasts?
the society. I answer questions, things like that as they come in. Not really working on anything in particular right now. No.
I mean, you deserve a break, honestly. You've been doing work for decades and decades and decades. You deserve a chance to let other people do it for a little while.
Yeah, well, I will say one thing about the movie coming out is it brought in so many people that we now have people who specialize in different aspects of the sinking, and you might get somebody who specializes just in Murdoch, or somebody who just specializes in the way the ship broke up, or something like that. And so, fortunately, now there are people who can do more in-depth research because no one person can live long enough to study
Yeah.
everything that happened that night.
That's true. It is a basic impossibility to study everything that happened on that night to remember.
Yes, yes.
Well, thank you so much for coming on. I'm sorry that I was late. I would offer an excuse if I had one. I don't.
Yeah.
It's just that I got the times wrong. But thank you so much for coming on.
You're very welcome. Yeah, I enjoyed it.
Thank you so much, and we will see everyone next time.
Right.